Okay, so hello again. It must be a bit of a problem for all of you with this decision by the government to close the schools down for a long time. So for that reason, I will be producing a number of videos for you to prepare you for, first of all, in grade 11, I will be giving you your test, of course, of chapter 5. I know that there are 4 students who have already completed that, but I think it would probably be a good exercise for them to do the test again. So I think all of the students should be writing the chapter 5 test. So, and then what we're going to do is we're going to start doing videos on the A-level syllabus as well. So the next video that I do, I will be starting on chapter 6, and then if this sort of delay of the school will continue, then I will do chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, and I suppose, you know, if this keeps going until May, which I don't think it will, then we'll have to do all the exam preparation for the final AS paper. And then, of course, the A-level paper will be written in October. So for that reason, we have a pretty good amount of time to do the A-level paper. We have about sort of 8 months until we have to write that one. But certainly for the AS level, we're going to basically just finish this unit 5, and then all of you will be moving on to the A level. Probably by April, May, closer to the time, we can go over some past AS exam papers. But at the moment, I think since we have already done the syllabus 2 times, and I think Mr. Remy did it as well, so that might be even 3 times that we've done the AS syllabus, I think we need to sort of move on. So after this chapter 5, then I think all of us need to move on to the A-level curriculum. Okay, I have sent you already, I've sent you a lot of material through the Google Classroom. Obviously, if you're not getting the Google Classroom, or if your email is not working, then you need to contact me as quickly as possible, because this is the way that we will be communicating for a long time. So for that reason, you know, make sure that your Google Classroom is in working order. Now, in the Google Classroom, you should have a paper called Government Macro Intervention, which looks a bit like that with a little cartoon. And it basically is the revision of chapter 5. Okay, and so this is really the wrap-up. We were going to have 1 class for the revision and then 1 class for the test, and then we were going to move on to chapter 6 and the A-level. So what you should do right now is you should, at home, you should have your book out, or it might be in a PDF file or whatever. You should have the course book that looks a bit like that, and you should have it open to chapter 5 so that you can see exactly where we are. You should also have the paper in your hand. You should have an exercise book and a pen and a ruler so that we can actually do graphs, etc., when the graphs are necessary. Okay, if you look at the first bit of the revision exercise here, we can see that the first issue is fiscal policies, and I even gave you the page on the book, 115, where fiscal policies are talked about, and this is on the very second page of the chapter, and they talk a lot about fiscal policies. Okay, now, one of the issues about fiscal policies is that many people make the mistake to believe that fiscal policies is everything to do with Keynesians and monetary policies are everything to do with monetarists. And this is actually a big mistake, and it will be taken into consideration when they mark your paper, so don't make this mistake. Clearly, Keynesians do put much more emphasis on fiscal policies, and monetarists put much more emphasis on monetary policies. But it doesn't mean for one moment that monetarists, i.e. people like conservatives, right-wing politicians, I don't know, people like Donald Trump, that they don't think about taxation and spending, because they obviously do. And in the same way that monetarists put most of their emphasis on monetary policies as creating a catalyst to stimulate economic growth. Now, isn't it ridiculous to suggest that monetarists would totally ignore fiscal policies and Keynesians would totally ignore monetary policy? It just doesn't happen. But you need to put an emphasis on it, and you have to state in your essay, in your exam essay, that the demand side economists, such as Keynesians, always use fiscal policies as a key to their solving of all the 6 macroeconomic problems like inflation, unemployment, etc., etc. Okay? So the first thing you need to do is you need to go to page 115 and you need to read that little sort of section. And it's very, very obvious what it's telling us. It's telling us that it's the use of taxation and government spending to influence aggregate demand. Okay, now you all know what aggregate demand means, and clearly they believe, particularly Keynesians, but monetarists obviously do as well, but mostly Keynesians, they believe that through using taxation, and in particular progressive taxation, where the percentage increase will actually go up as your income goes up. Not just that your taxation goes up, but the percentage taxation will actually go up. In other words, you go up into a higher tax bracket if in fact you're earning more money. Now I would say since about 1936, when John Maynard Keynes wrote his book, The General Theory, that this has been the general belief of most Western politicians today in trying to promote some form of equity in society, is that progressive taxation is really, really important, okay? And so that's why Keynesians see this as kind of like a key to solving their problems. Okay, now obviously it's not just the fact that you're going to tax them, you're also going to be spending money in a particular way. And we all know that low-income people have a high marginal propensity to consume. Okay, it means that lower-income people will spend new money much quicker than rich people. This, if you believe that aggregate demand will solve a lot of the problems. Remember that John Maynard Keynes suggested that a lot of the problems were caused by what he referred to as insufficient aggregate demand. And that means that there's not enough spending, okay? That there's not enough spending in society, and this causes a problem because 70% of the GDP is caused by consumption. So from a Keynesian perspective, fiscal policies are really, really important, okay? Because they are able not only to tax in a progressive manner, but they can also spend with giving a priority to public services such as public health and public education to make sure that everybody benefits from, wealth that is created in society. Now, as we all know, a lot of monetarists, a lot of conservatives, a lot of wealthy people don't really see the value in equity. Okay, they don't seem to feel that being more equal is necessarily a good thing. Okay, Joseph Stalin was an example of someone who really, really believed in absolute equity. That, whether you were a nuclear scientist or you were someone who collected the garbage, you should all be earning the same, and we should all be working for the state, and et cetera, et cetera. And in many ways, he succeeded. Okay, I don't think anyone can deny that he succeeded in his dream of creating an equal society. But of course, you know, society had to give up a lot of things to create that level of equity. And people have to say, is absolute equity that important? Well, some people do. Okay, we have to accept that particularly the lowest, the poorest people in society probably would consider equity to be the most important thing in their lives, because they look around the world and they see a lot of wealth and they feel that they're not sharing in that wealth, and they feel that there's a lot of injustice in society, and therefore we need to do something about that. Okay, so for that reason, a lot of the policies of many of the famous economists who had a centrally planned perspective in their analysis, they would definitely consider, equity to be the most important. But Vietnam, I think, in my opinion, okay, and Canada for that amount, for that matter, don't see it quite that way. They consider it to be important. Both Canada and Vietnam consider equity to be important, but they feel that there are other things that are also important. And that's why, every day you can see inequity in Vietnam, and you can see inequity in Canada. But people somehow accept it more easily than in some other countries where equity is considered a lot more important. Certainly Ho Chi Minh, after the war, I mean, his vision of the new society and what he was fighting for was certainly not to rebuild a free market economy, and I tend to agree with him. I tend to be a great lover of Ho Chi Minh, and so for that reason I would agree with the idea that the people of Vietnam have not suffered for 100 years of war just to create a new exploiting social class in Vietnam. He was a great believer in an equal society, a society where you could use fiscal policies to create a better society for everybody, not just the rich people, but for everybody. Today, and you can use this in your essays, things have changed because of technology. Today, you can have what they call offshore bank accounts to hide your money. If you have a little shop, it's very easy to sort of say, oh, I made no money this week, and therefore how can you tax me when I didn't make any money? So the government is kind of left to sort of be in a situation of kind of going around begging shops to give them some tax revenue, because obviously the government cannot survive without government revenue. So for that reason, a lot of governments today have shifted their emphasis of fiscal policies away from direct taxation to indirect taxation, things like sales tax and VAT. And we've talked about this in class before, and the reason being that it's much easier for the government to raise revenue through sales tax than it is to try to chase people around the street asking for money that they had earned. So what you will notice, I mean, you can ask your parents about this, what you will notice is that a lot of people a lot of tax policies in Vietnam are being changed, whereby the direct taxation, in other words income tax, seems to be going down. The percentage of tax seems to be going down, yet the level of sales tax seems to be going up. And this is an indicator that the government is trying to shift their emphasis away from trying to raise revenue by income tax and hoping that they can raise the same amount of revenue by by sales tax. So now what I would like you to do is, you all know the famous graph. I'm not going to say the name of it, but I want you to draw it in your notes right now. The graph that shows us that the larger the percentage of income tax, the percentage income tax, eventually you will start to decline. It will go up in the beginning and then it will actually decline. Okay, you should all know this graph. So turn off the YouTube video or whatever for a few minutes, and then draw that graph in your exercise book. Okay, the next topic that, if you look on the list, is something called discretionary fiscal policies, and we can see in your book I gave you the page number where it says deliberate changes in the government spending and taxation. So this is something which is the word discretionary really means that it's up to the government to change their fiscal policies. If they decide that they want to raise or decrease their level of taxation or whatever, or their spending strategies, they will do so. Sometimes it will be caused by wealthy people who basically feel that the government is spending all their money on helping lower income people. So for example, if the government is spending a lot of money to subsidize public transportation, well, rich people often don't take public transportation, and therefore they would say, you're taxing me the most, and then you're giving the money to things like public education and public transport, which the people who actually paid the majority of that tax will never benefit from. So for that reason, they may lobby, which is a word to say that they will go and they will argue with the government to say, you need to reduce the level of taxation, or you need to give us, the rich people, some benefits as well from all this money that you have raised through taxation, not just low-income people. Now, depending on the government, it depends on how they may feel about that. Certainly in Canada, the Liberal Party of Canada would be probably quite open to the idea of saying, okay, well, we need to help the rich people too. And in some ways, I would suspect that the Vietnamese government would be a little bit less open to that, but I'm not too sure. I've only been here now for a year, so I cannot say absolutely the priorities of the government. But I would suspect that the Communist Party of Vietnam, the government of Vietnam, would be more predisposed in trying to maintain spending and taxation policies which are helpful to the lower income population. Okay, the next one was automatic stabilizers, and again I gave you the page number. It says changes in government spending and taxation that occur to reduce fluctuations in aggregate demand without any alteration in government policy. Okay, so these are policies that imply that the government may be forced to change their policies due to, for example, something like inflation. If they suddenly discovered that their spending policies were causing a lot of inflation, then they may decide to reduce that amount of spending so that they could reduce the level of inflation. Okay, so this is really what an automatic stabilizer refers to. It's kind of like the idea that governments, apart from the political priorities that they have, that they're kind of waiting to see the response of their policies. And if they see that their policies are not working very well, then suddenly they will decide to change their fiscal policies. Okay? I mean, we've got easy ones like the word budget. Budget is something that you need to know yourself when you get out of school and you start working and you have an income, which is revenue, and you have spending, you need to pay for your rent, etc., etc. You need to have a bit of a budget where you have income and then you have money that is being spent, and then hopefully that you are not going into debt so that you have more income than you are spending. So it's not just individuals, but obviously governments have budgets as well, and certainly the Ministry of Finance have budgets. In the real world, we all know that most countries, including Canada, including Vietnam, we all spend more than we receive, and therefore there has to be some sort of policy in dealing with debt. But that's a different issue. I don't want to get into that too quickly here. But basically, just so that you know that a budget is a bit like an account sheet where you have money coming in, money going out. I mean, it's one of the most basic things in economics that a student can learn, is to know exactly how much money are they spending, are they spending too much, can they cut down on their expenses, etc., etc. Okay, cyclical budget deficit, okay, we can see that on page 116, so turn the page, okay, so you can see that a budget deficit caused by changes in economic activity. Okay, so remember the story of the pig cycle with the sows, the female pigs that are pregnant for 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days, and that basically kind of helps us to understand the cycle of most economies, where you tend, certainly in a free market, to have a boom, and then there's a bust, and then there's a boom, and then there's a bust. And so basically this is a little bit difficult to predict, the troughs, the lower level, how low will it go, and will the booms be really, really high? I mean, just the fact that we have the virus problems now is a really good example of exogenous factors, outside factors, that suddenly cause the Vietnamese economy a great deal of harm. I mean, probably, we could all write an essay on, how the coronavirus is disturbing the Vietnamese economy, and how this has really nothing to do with Vietnam. We've been, doing our job really well. We're working really hard. Our economists have been doing a good job, but suddenly now we don't have any Chinese tourists. I was at the airport even yesterday, and there was almost nobody at the airport. Even in London, I was watching the news. They were saying that the shopping malls in Britain are actually quite empty because people don't want to socialize too much in public because everybody's scared of getting the coronavirus. This has to be the absolute best example of exogenous factors that are impossible to control, and this is why we have this type of cyclical budget deficit, where it depends on the economic cycle, and it certainly will depend on any outside forces. And then we have structural budget deficits. And this is a budget deficit caused by an imbalance between government spending and taxation. So this would be not exogenous, this would be endogenous, D-O-G-E-N-O-U-S, I think it's spelled endogenous, which is the opposite of exogenous, and that this is an imbalance caused by government policy. So if you got it wrong, if you basically flooded the market with money, maybe through quantitative easing, okay, QE, as we all know, the idea of printing more money to solve your short-term macroeconomic problems. If suddenly you suddenly create this huge problem of inflation caused by you sort of swamping the market full of new money, then clearly, you need to take a bit of responsibility for that. And this is what we call structural budget deficits. Okay, then the next one is monetary policy. Okay, and you should definitely be able to answer essays and vocabulary questions on monetary policies. This is really, really big. This is something that Milton Friedman talked about. This is what even Adam Smith talked about. He basically believed that if you could control the money supply, that you could solve the economic macroeconomic problems. And that, the implication is that fiscal policies are not that important, that really monetary policies are really what you need to worry about. And so, we can think of lots of examples of monetary policies. Certainly the biggest one probably would be interest rates. Conservative governments often use interest rates as a means of stimulating the economy by making borrowing either less or more expensive, which in theory would mean that banks would be passing on the higher or lower interest rates to consumers, and consumers have to make a decision based on the opportunity costs of investment as to whether this is a good idea or a bad idea to borrow money. And so there's lots of examples. Okay, we've dealt with it quite a bit in class. You should be pretty comfortable if you get an essay question, something like, what is monetary policy and how will this solve macroeconomic problems? Okay, you should be able, I would say if you're looking for an A, and all of you should be looking for an A, then giving one example probably is not okay. Okay, so if you just give me an example of interest rates, you'll probably get a C. Okay, so what you really need to do is you need to plan for this in advance. Think about maybe three good examples of monetary policies that could essentially increase or decrease the amount of money floating around in the economy, okay? So that the circular flow of money, the velocity is faster, and this will actually, stimulate the economy, etc., etc. Now, this may be caused by government policies which make foreign investment a lot more profitable, and therefore people are going to rush in and try to invest in Vietnam, for example, if they feel that business is very profitable, it's very easy to get your profits out of the country, or it may be the reserve ratio, where you're making a decision on what percentage of banks that they need to keep in liquid form, okay, we call dead money, money that has to be sitting around doing nothing. And of course banks go crazy with that. So if you increase the reserve ratio, then you definitely would be taking more money out of circulation. The banks, let's say, would have to have, in Canada, I think I told you already, it's about 7%, and the government feels that 7% is a fair percentage to make sure that there's enough liquidity in the market that anybody who wants to take their money out of their bank account can do so immediately, and that there will be no crisis. Remember, I said to you that before the economic crisis in Korea and Russia and Argentina, and there's a few others, where basically the banks were deregulated. They had almost no regulations in this regard at all, and you found that there was almost no reserve ratio. I mean, maybe it was 1% or half of 1%. So banks really had very little money in reserve, for customers to come in and demand their money. So this led to a run on the currency and caused a crash and bankruptcies of the bank. They had to close the banks, And I think that certainly the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and many of the regulators, the central banks, they have learned from this experience, and they have decided that they need to increase their reserve ratio to make sure that banks don't just lend every single dollar that they have to a new customer so that they can maximize their profits. They actually want, they want, the banks clearly, they want to have the least money sitting around doing nothing. And the government, I mean, I wouldn't say that they want the most, but they want enough to make sure that banks are playing honestly and that they are not really playing a very high risk game which could cause a crash in the banking system. I mean, that's almost a national security question where, if you crash the American economy, then that would be, a social equivalent of, an invasion by a foreign country. I mean, that would be so unbelievably serious. So most governments don't want this to happen, a bankruptcy. Because when you go bankrupt, it also means that none of your bonds have any value at all. Immediately, the bond value goes to zero. So all the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who own bonds, they're buying debt, they're buying treasury bills, which is government bonds, that they'll never get their money back. Oh, I tell you that the people will be angry if that happens. So nobody wins in a bankrupt situation. And a lot of banks, because they are profit maximizers and they're prepared to take risks with other people's money, they do it all the time. And we have to be a little bit sort of careful as to, what the banks are getting themselves into. Okay? The interest rate, okay, well, obviously the interest rate is something that should be pretty clear. It's the extra amount of money that you pay when you borrow money, or on the other side, if you're putting money in, you're actually getting interest rate, which is a little bit like an incentive for you to hold your money in the bank. And of course, the money that you receive as a depositor is always going to be less than the money that you need to pay as a borrower. So for that reason, the banks will make a profit. Okay, I think here in Vietnam, I think it depends on which bank you go to. I have a bank account in the HSBC, and they actually give a very low rate of interest. I think it's about 4% interest in a savings account. But there are some banks that will offer 8% to depositors. But try to borrow some money. I mean, ask your parents how much it will cost them to borrow, let's say, I don't know, 100 million dong. They will probably pay about 20%. Okay, so you don't need to be a rocket scientist to realize that 20% minus 8% maybe is 12%, which is a lot of money, and that's basically the profit of the banks. So the banks are going to basically make sure that there is always this spread between the interest rates that they have to pay to lenders compared to the amount of interest that is paid to the banks by borrowers. Okay, the money supply, well, I think we talked about that a little bit already. The money supply is really related to the circular flow diagram, and the money supply is really related to how much money is circulating in the economy. This is key, particularly for monetarists, on how to control the economy and how to squeeze inflation out of the economy, how to make a productive economy, etc., etc. Okay, supply side policies, okay, that's page 116. Supply side policies are basically pro-business policies, and we've talked about this a lot in class. It tends to be promoted by monetarists, by conservatives, by business owners, by wealthy people, basically people who are trying to make their economy more pro-business. And you may make your economy more pro-business by having less regulation, less paperwork, maybe less taxes, easy export of profits. There's often in many countries that they say that there's too many rules on how they can take the money out of the country. And of course, a company like McDonald's or Burger King, they're not that interested in just developing their business in Vietnam or feeding the Vietnamese. They're basically trying to make money for their shareholders. That's the whole logic of business. So they want to know how can they take money out of the economy and move it back to the United States where their shareholders are. So they want to be able to convert that money into, let's say, US dollars and export the money as quickly as possible. So in the beginning, a lot of these multinational corporations, they will have a bump and like money coming in, but eventually you're going to find that the money coming out will be much greater than any sum that they brought in, because obviously that is the idea of business. They're trying to make a profit, and they're trying to make a profit for their shareholders, that most of whom live outside of the country. Okay, expenditure switching policies. Okay, we've got that on page 119. Okay, and you can see it. Open your book there and look on the right hand side on the bottom of the page, and you can see that it's policy measures designed to encourage people to switch from buying foreign produced products to buying domestically produced products. And that's pretty common, you know. I mean, it's pretty common, particularly when I was young. Everybody would say, oh, if you love your country, you need to buy Canadian products. Okay, and even if the product was not as good as, let's say, an American product or a Japanese product, you would do it because you love Canada. And I think that was true in Vietnam as well. There's a certain amount of patriotism intertwined with that. Donald Trump is trying to promote this type of policy where you basically, if you love America, you'll believe in America first policies, etc., etc. This doesn't quite work so well anymore, okay? In your generation, and I'm not criticizing your generation, but there's a difference between my generation and your generation. Your generation basically wants the least expensive product and the highest quality product put together, and that's what you're going to buy. And whether it's made in Vietnam or made somewhere else, probably, and I don't want to sound critical, probably you don't care. But the bottom line is that this is actually damaging to the Vietnamese economy, because probably if you had the choice between a Vietnamese telephone and a Japanese telephone or a Korean telephone, you probably would take the Korean telephone. That is the reality of life. So I would say that it's quite common, this idea of expenditure switching policies, but it's not as common as it used to be. Today, most people, I would say, everywhere in the world, they've lost that sense of nationalism, and they're more internationalist in nature. And whether it's produced in Japan or Brazil or somewhere in Africa or in Europe, nobody seems to care anymore as long as they get the best product at the cheapest price. Okay? Then there's the expenditure dampening or reducing policy, and you can see that at the bottom of your page again, page 119, and it says very clearly here, a policy measures designed to reduce imports and increase exports by reducing demand. Okay, so really, what is that really telling us? The idea of reducing imports. How do you do that? How do you actually get people to buy fewer imports? Well, probably the best example of such a policy would be an import tax, or what we call a tariff. okay? And a lot of protectionists, people who believe in protectionism as a form of trade policy, they would believe in that. Donald Trump probably believes in it. They believe that by putting taxes on Chinese chairs and tables that you can buy at Walmart for $1, that they're too cheap and that they're suspected of dumping all these products at such a cheap price that they have successfully destroyed the furniture production business in the United States. And so therefore, they're going to do everything that they can to reduce imports. And by taxing these imports, you have the double whammy of encouraging people to buy the local products that now seem to be more or less, the same price as the imports, but also the government makes a certain amount of revenue. And therefore, this is actually a good thing for the government. So they like the idea of making government revenue. Okay, so this is the first page of, we're going to stop here for a moment, and we're going to continue this on the next video. What I want you to do in each one of these words, starting at the top with fiscal policies, going all the way down to expenditure dampening or reducing policies, in your exercise book, I want you to write the definition clearly, okay? And I want you to read over it a couple of times, because I guarantee you that these are words that will be used on the test. And more importantly, on your final AS paper, the use of these types of words will move you from a C to an A star very quickly. And you're at, Chu Van An, you are not looking for a C. You are looking for an A or a B, okay? And you're not just looking to pass. And therefore, you need to get used to the idea of using subject-specific vocabulary. So we're going to stop here, okay? And we're going to continue this on video number 2. Okay, bye-bye.